So today's a special day. We've invited Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe to come and have a look at the site that he first excavated in 1963.
Barry Cunliffe is an extremely good field archaeologist. He knows how to look at the remains in the ground and interpret them and understand them. And to have someone just to talk to you about what he sees and then to bounce your ideas off him, again, it's just very useful.
You know, he was the first modern archaeologist to really examine this area and try and make sense of it all, even though it was exposed by the Victorians.
What he has also been able to do is recall certain things from that time. So he's still been able to contribute in a very positive way to our thinking about how the site has developed.
I first got involved with the Roman baths in 1963 when I came as a lecturer in Bristol University.
He was invited because he knew various archaeologists who were interested in the archaeology of Bath to come and do some excavations.
We looked at the baths and realised that there was a huge amount of unanswered questions. I remember coming here as a kid, and I was about 14, 15, and sitting in one of the exedrae around the baths with the guidebook that was then available, a sort of scruffy old guidebook, and seeing bits that said unexcavated and unknown around the baths, getting quite sort of irritated and saying, why is this unexcavated? Why is it unknown? That was 1954, and 1964 I was actually answering the question. We used our spare time to try and work out all those bits of the baths that no one really looked at, and that's how we came into this space for the first time. And no one had asked all the questions that modern archaeologists were asking. So we were feeling like pioneers, but pioneers in someone else's world. It's very odd coming back. I mean, it isn't the first time I've been back here in 50 years, because I've been involved with the baths over quite a long time. We were able to talk to one of my colleagues, Pete, who's been working on the baths with me, and then later after I stopped working here, and talking to the other archaeologists who are working here now. And it all started coming back.
You know, having that context from someone who dug here for years when we've only been here for a few weeks is absolutely invaluable.
In the Roman bathing establishments, they did have sort of running courts. You can see a whole series of little thin layers of sand and grit. And it's the sort of thing that you might expect to find if that was a running area.
It was really interesting to hear Barry Cunliffe talking about his time in the 60s here. For archaeologists, that's almost another era, another time.
It's a great opportunity just to talk about how the archaeology was done then, in the contrast of the sort of modern professional era. And what was done in the 1960s with volunteers and with very few resources.
But also then to have him look at various areas in the structures around us and say, now when I dug that in the 60s, I wasn't sure what that meant, and I was a bit puzzled by that. Can we have another look at that? Because these are the questions I've got in my mind, which I didn't answer back then.
It was very reassuring looking at the old plans to see they more or less do work. Coming back and sort of reliving my old trenches is very curious. To feel that you're part of the archaeology of the site is a bit unnerving.
It's interesting that we keep returning to sites that have been dug by archaeologists or pseudo-archaeologists in the past. So you came and saw everything that the Victorians had dug, and then Peter came and excavated some of the stuff that you'd looked at.
That's
and now we're back again.
Yeah.
If our predecessors hadn't done that, or if you hadn't done it or I hadn't done it, and Simon doesn't do it from now on, we can't build on it.
After all, this is all our histories. This is our shared history. We are very, very privileged as archaeologists to be able to excavate it and touch it and discover it. And it's our duty to share this with people. I think when people come here, when this is all laid open, it's going to really make them, looking at a plain Roman building is fine, but to look at it in these contexts and to think of how it was found, how it was discovered, and what goes on after the building. You're really going to be able to get a feeling of the time going on. The new work that's going on is marvellous. It's adding new detail. Every time, every trench we looked into, there was something new to see, some little chink of understanding.
to be sort of following in his footsteps, as it were, down here. It's been a real honour to meet him and to sort of talk through it all again.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to relive a bit of my past.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Tim Darwell. I'm the chairman of the Board of Directors of Cotswold Archaeology, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to this, our 28th Mick Aston Lecture. I'm sorry for those who came in a bit early that the videos that we were showing for a few minutes beforehand lacked their sound. We're not quite sure what happened there, but many apologies. Those of you who are good at lip reading will at least have picked up some of what was being said, I hope. And I hope you'll all have marvelled at the wonderful pictures of Bath, which is going to be part of our lecture this evening. Well, the Mick Aston series is held in honour of one of our former trustees, Mick Aston, who's very well known, of course, as the leader of the Time team for many years. And Mick was a great supporter of archaeology in and around the Cotswolds because, of course, he was based at Bristol for a very long time. Well, tonight it's a great pleasure to have this lecture, and we've got a lot of people logged on from right across the world. I think we've got more than 250 by the look of it just at the moment, and more people seem to be joining as we're going along. Could I ask you to say hello to each other by using the chat box? I see one or two of you already have. We've got somebody from Scotland waving at us on a little message I can see down in the corner of my screen. So do say hello, tell us where you've come from, tell us what the weather's like there, if you like as well. The webinar system that we're using in Zoom tonight doesn't allow you to raise your hand, but we would like you to ask questions and to make comments as we go along. And if you'd like to put that into the Q&A box, then our speaker and our team here will be able to see that and we'll be able to respond to that at the end. Indeed, we hope to have a short period for questions at the end of the lecture this evening. So do pop those questions into your Q&A box as we're going along and we'll respond to them. Also, if you have any technical problems as we go along, then please put that in the Q&A box as well and we'll be able to pick that up and try and sort something out. We're already sorting out a few technical problems, but if there's any more, we'll deal with that as well. We're going to be recording this lecture this evening, and it will be available in about 2 weeks' time on the Cotswold Archaeology YouTube channel. So if you want to reprise the lecture and come back and hear it, do dip into that and do notify other people who might be interested in what's being said tonight to go to that YouTube channel and have a look at the videos which are on display there, because there's some fantastic stuff to have a look at. At the end of the seminar, there's going to be, as you log out, there's going to be a little questionnaire. We'd love to hear your views about how we can make things better. We understand about the sound already, but lots of thoughts on that. We'd welcome your comments on it. Well, this evening, it's a great pleasure to welcome Peter Davenport to our Mick Aston Lecture. Peter's been a professional archaeologist for 46 years, and he's worked at a variety of organisations, notably the Bath Archaeological Trust and more recently Cotswold Archaeology. He's mostly been working on publications and on heritage consultancy in various fields, and he's now working as a freelance archaeological consultant, mostly working on the built heritage, and he's a consultant in these fields, as well as working on some of the excavation backlogs from work in Bath over the years. Peter's got extensive experience of all sorts of periods of British archaeology and has written a whole range of papers and monographs on major site reports from prehistoric times right up to medieval and post-medieval material as well. And of course, he's very well known for presenting material through the media about archaeology and heritage to all sorts of audiences. And as you can imagine, lectures and TV programs and radio and all these sorts of things. Well, Peter has recently been appointed as a trustee of the Roman Baths Foundation in Bath, and he's also a member of the academic advisory boards of Cotswold Archaeology and also the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society. And most recently, he's just published a book, Roman Bath, A New History and Archaeology of Aquae Sulis, that came out in 2021. Some of you may have seen it already. So that book provides the core, I think, of the theme of tonight's lecture, which is entitled Revisiting the Theatre, a Roman Theatre at Bath. So Peter, we invite you to come and give the Mick Aston Lecture for 2022. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try and share my screen now. get the right, what's going on with that one as usual? That's funny. Now, why weren't that? It worked before. We're there. Okay, let me drop that down. Okay, well, hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking about why I think there's a lecture, a theatre at Bath during the Roman period. The remains that I'm interpreting, reinterpreting, have been known for a very long time, but they've been interpreted in different ways over the years. Just to set the scene a little, here's an aerial photograph of the centre of the city of Bath, basically the Georgian city. Here's the circus and the crescent, the Roman baths and the Abbey Church are down here. The green outline is where we know that there is Roman settlement, occupation, people living and shop and working. A couple of small country houses scattered around, and the blue lines are the Roman roads, which we're fairly sure about now. The hot springs are down here, and at a point, probably in the 2nd century, the Romans enclosed the central area with an earthen bank, or sand and gravel to be more accurate, that later became the foundation for the medieval city walls. But that doesn't concern us here. We're going to be talking about, bang in the center, the King's Bath, the Roman Baths, and at the east end of the Roman Baths and Temple Precinct, these remains that I'm going to tell you are a theatre. They were recorded, these remains, we're looking at this area here. Here's the King's Bath and the Roman Spring. Here's the northern side of the Great Bath, the Roman Baths, and the Temple and its precinct hub off in this direction. This painting was made in just after 1900 from records made by Richard Mann. Richard Mann's an interesting character who worked for Major Davis, but being a much better archaeologist than Major Davis, rather fell out with him. And in fact, managed to record much of this while he was officially banned from the site. It was a building site, part of the museum that is now in place. This little bit here just shows you the corner of the Abbey. Those of you who know Bath you'll know where that is. We'll be coming back to this, but basically we're looking at what is part of a portico, which was in front of the entrance to the Temple Precinct. Some buildings here, which we know a little bit more about now, but not much. And this structure here, which I'm going to say is the theatre. And here's the great drain, the culverted covered drain, which takes the surplus hot water from the King's Bath, from the sacred spring, the Fons Sulis, as the Romans called it, the fountain of Sulis, the well of Sulis, and kind of provided a division between the baths and this big structure up here. This is another of Richard Mann's drawings, showing us a bit more clearly what was going on here. Here are the baths, the great baths, the swimming pool. Here's the source of all the hot water, the King's Baths it currently is. Temple Precinct up here with a temple over on the left, out of shot here. And then this structure. This is made of coursed rubble set in a very tough mortar. It's basically concrete, but very carefully laid stone and rubble concrete with walls running through it, voids in it, almost like rooms, properly finished off, and a kind of a monumental facade at this end. I'll come back to this, this drawing in a moment. What we're looking at here is what was left after various destructions. It's not the shape that the Romans left, it's what Richard Mann saw in 1892 and 1893. And back in 1969, Barry Cunliffe actually suggested that these remains might well be part of a theatre. But then he was involved in, he was asked to write an essay for an American academic for her Festschrift, her retirement sort of present of academic papers. And he started looking through the stone store of the Roman baths and found these 3 stones. There's another one in store. They're on a curve. They're part of the entablature, that they are the frieze, the carved frieze of a circular building or a semicircular building, only less than an eighth of the circumference found. But Barry remeasured it quite carefully and found that the 19th century records, these stones were found during the 19th century excavations of Major Davis. He found that actually they'd been mismeasured and they were twice the diameter that had been published previously. And the diameter he calculated was exactly the same as the width of the Temple of Solis Minerva. He came up with the idea that this might well represent, and he might well be right, a circular temple, 27 feet in diameter, with basically a circle of columns supporting this very high quality carved frieze. It has figures on it with drapery, plant and floral carving. It's probably 2nd century in date from the stylistic, but it's very high quality, a bit more vegetation here and there's more figures in this one. So he came up with the idea that this was the building that might well be represented by these fragments. And we do have one of these columns. They were all found, these fragments, in the 19th century, round about here during excavations, not over here at all. But their exact position, as is typical with 19th century excavations, wasn't recorded. But I started to question Barry Cunliffe's idea of this, this podium being the support, the base for the tholos, because it's really quite slight what he's reconstructed here. And this is, we know this is the ground level that goes with it. We know that the ground slopes up very slightly from here to here. This, by the way, is a model in the museum. It's a very fine model of the very late period into the early 4th century, probably, of Roman times. So we've got this structure which doesn't really work with the archaeology. Here's the tholos just on the edge of the picture. Here's the entrance to the Temple Precinct. Here are the baths in the background. This little building we know existed, we don't know what it was, butts up to this structure, this concrete structure we were looking at. But it's only a few feet high here, you see, and we know from the old records that it was actually considerably taller and more massive than that. Just by the by, this is a gravel courtyard which was recorded in the 19th century, and we were able to re-excavate a tiny fraction of it back in 2011, which survived the destructive work of the 19th century, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we were able to date that, and we show that this gravel floor, this gravel courtyard, was laid probably in the later 2nd century. And we were also able to see from Richard Mann's records that this 2nd century surface was laid down later than this podium. So the podium predates the later 2nd century. Nonetheless, the tholos idea is still up and running. Here's a Roman Baths Museum graphic showing the temple, the tholos on its little podium, the Roman baths here, and underneath that building, the hot springs. And well, everybody really believes there is a theatre at Bath. The question was, where was it? So we've got here, we put it here. And there is some reason for that. There was a big foundation found here during a rescue excavation in the 90s, big wall of more than 2 meters across. And this big chunk of carved cornice was found again in the 19th century, sort of across the street from where that theatre might have been. And the point about this is that it's huge. The photograph was reproduced 1:5, which means that it's over a foot high, and that's only the part of the cornice of the entablature. It's more than twice the scale of the Roman temple of Solis Minerva. It's a very large building, but we don't know any more about it. But going back to our structure, it's obviously quite a complex structure, and at one time people thought it was 2 phases. I think it's fairly clear now that it's not. But looking at the old records again. But it's not really a simple flat platform on which you could build a tholos, a circular temple. It's quite complicated. You've got walls running back. These are a metre across, these walls. These blocks are stone, pier bases. They're the bases of tall stone piers built into the wall here, and they're over a metre and more in dimension. And we know that there are three. Richard Mann was unable to see this area properly or to understand this. There is, in fact, another wall running up like that. Oops, wrong one. And what everybody until the 1980s thought was a niche cut into the front of this building actually is a medieval well cutting through another big stone block or series of blocks. This is Mann's section of the podium. And from there to there is, that's from the Roman foundation level up to the surviving top of the structure recorded by Mann. It's 3.5 meters. It's about 12 feet. It's very, very substantial. What he shows here is what he was able to see surviving various later destructive works. This he seems to have seen in section only. He marks up here that it was removed in the 18th century. And then he says that here it was removed in ancient times, by which he means Saxon or medieval probably. But this was the edge of it. This is the southern wall, the southern foundation, those big stone blocks and the wall between them. This is the Roman drain running in between this structure and the Roman baths. That's the foundations of the Roman baths walling. And we're very fortunate that Mann recorded all this because Major Davis actually, when he sort of banned Richard Mann from coming onto site, even refused to think this was actually a structure. He said it was just a load of fallen rubble. This is looking from the south up towards that big platform. This is the Great Drain, again removed during the destructive works of the 1890s. This is a section through the hot spring, the King's Bath. These are various walls built between the temple and the hot spring and our structure, our theatre. And what I'm showing here is the ground level is actually just below the top of the culvert, which I can quickly say is a late Roman feature and wasn't there when they started to build what I'm going to call the theatre for ease of reference rather than keep calling it the structure. These big blocks here, another one there. So 1, 2, 3, wall in between them, recessed. And then this 8 foot, at this point, 8 or 10 foot high basement structure, of which this is just the surviving southern edge. And it was built from about this level in the later 2nd century. And what's interesting is this is probably an early wall as well, but the ground level seems to have been deliberately raised in the late 2nd or 3rd century. And this wall here, its ground level is way up there, and this is all foundation and infill. So we've got quite a sequence of structures going on, of events going on. Just to show you what they actually look like in the museum, this southern elevation still survives in the museum. And you can see, well, if I tell you that that's more than a metre across, and these blocks are the lowest course pretty much. This is 19th century paving, but this is about the Roman level that this was built from. There are lots of Victorian and more recent structures obscuring what you can see now. So I'll show you something in a moment. But this is the infill wall. See how it's set back from these columns, these pier bases, and it continues across that way. That's the best photograph I could take in the museum as it is now. Here's that late wall with its ground level right up there, and this is the footings and foundations. That's a doorstep, so there's a ground level way up there somewhere in a later building. This is the corner of our structure. These big, it's set back that way and set back that way. It's covered up by a modern museum structure, but it's there. And this is the one you saw in the previous picture. And there's the wall that links it to the other one, the third pier base. But what made me think again that it was much more like to be a theatre, it was a piece of work we did back in 1987, which is basically re-excavating a bit of Victorian work. This is the big stone pier, that base that Richard Mann had recorded. This is it on the plan, and this is the medieval well cut through it. The blue stuff is Victorian building covering everything up. That's the Roman wall, much chopped about, running back from that pier. But what was interesting when we planned it in great detail was that this pier was actually angled very slightly off in that direction. The other two piers are parallel to the wall. This pier is just beginning to angle off in that direction. And before I pursue that thought, here's a comparison of Richard Mann's records from the 1890s. It's a detail of the thing you saw before with the theatre, 1 pier, 2 piers, 3 piers. This is the corner. And then further back, the actual theatre extends beyond the corner. And it's a pretty good record for the 1890s. This is our work in the 1980s. These 2 blocks here are the equivalent of those 2 blocks. So we're up to that. And this is Victorian destruction, this area here. Here's the bottom of the stone block, and it's actually lower than these, but it's probably a foundation block at that point. And this is the structure on the other side that postdates it. Very clearly here you can see what's footing, what's a wall, and what's a doorstep. Probably another step below to get down to whatever was out here. Basically, at this late period, the drain was culverted, put into a covered tunnel, and buried up to this level. Various reasons for going. I won't go into the idea behind that, but it's quite clear. So putting what Richard Mann has told us about, what we were able to see, what we are able to see and we're able to see in recent work and in the museum now, you end up with these remains. And this little bit here, this is the structure that is just on a slight angle. And this wall, we dug a trench in a cellar, which is now part of the Roman baths storage area. Tiny little area, about a couple of feet across, and just picked up in the end a wall identical to this wall we were able to trace down over 1 meter, nearly 4 feet, about 1.2 meters, but we're unable to bottom it because of the restricted space and health and safety and so on. But the wall is very much like this fragment of wall and these walls, and it's on a curve. This area here, when Cotswold Archaeology did some work around Bath Abbey, which is what we're looking at, simplified plan here, underneath the medieval work and underneath the footings of the Norman Abbey, underneath the present Abbey, was a spread of mortared rubble, very similar to this. So maybe we've got more structure. This area is not available. We don't know what's there. But when, in the 1860s, a man called James Irvin was working in the Abbey, helping, he was clerk of works for the restoration in the 1860s. He did some archaeological investigations and found a little bit more of this just outside the west door up here. So this is what I'm putting together. We've got 3 walls, 3 massive walls, over 3 to 4 feet across, wide, an end wall, which was recesses with big stone blocks in it, and rooms in what might be the basement, as it were. Now, if we put that together, we end up, there's that little piece of archaeology that the Victorian Clerk of Works picked up. So that's what we've got. So if you believe me at all, that's what I'm proposing. Reconstruction at foundation level. Obviously, constructing the curve is a bit, it's very simple from that, but it's got certain margin of error, shall we say. But what we've got is, what we could have is basically the stage and the wings here, which is typical for a Roman theatre. Built rooms under the stage, not necessarily as many as I've shown, but rooms under the stage, the seating area, and the orchestra, the plain area, which Vitruvius says was where you sat the senators, but the important people in a Roman town. The Greek equivalent of these theatres had the chorus taking place in the orchestra, but the Romans just used it as more seating and more space. Reconstructing it, we end up with a speculative, very, very speculative reconstruction. A small version of this is in my book. That's the southern view. There are those three pier bases with the recessed walling, and I've presumed that there might be arched recesses with them. And then this is the structure enclosing the seats, and I've played around with possible access stairs and so on, but we don't know anything about that. But this speckled area is what I'm suggesting is represented by the mortared concrete rubble that we've picked up. So it's the foundation of the stage, what they call the skinae frons, the area behind at the back of the stage, and the seating. Now, I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be a grand masonry structure. It's next to, people often think that theatres in England, in Britain, should be, you know, if they've got stone footings, there should be timber and so on. But there are some very substantial stone masonry remains in various towns across the province, which I'll look at in a moment. Given that we've got massively constructed Roman baths with vaults, and huge piers and columns. We've got a temple of all of good cut stone, which of course is locally available, Bath stone. I see no reason why this shouldn't be a fully masonry built structure. I played even more games. Now, sorry about the poor quality of the 3D reconstruction. That's a problem with my software. But this is just to show a bit more interestingly what it might have been like. This is the gravel courtyard we were talking about, that it dates to the 2nd century and postdates this structure. The stage is behind here. These are the wings, as it were. This, of course, should be curved. This is the limits of the software. It's made it into straight sections. And this is the little building that was butted up against it later on. Another view. Here's the architectural background, which most theatres had. Here's the orchestra and the banks of seating. I haven't tried to show the access, which is all speculative anyway, in this one. Now, I introduced this talk by talking about the tholos, the idea of there being a circular temple. Well, of course, we only have 1/8 of it in actual fact. So I just wonder whether some of those elements could be used in the architectural backdrop that was common in these theatres. It doesn't really work. It's great fun. There's half a tholos, but it doesn't really work because every example I've been able to find has not a convex structure in the centre, but a concave one. And there are arguments that might make it work, but it's just an interesting idea. The columns could easily come from this, and the carved stonework may come from somewhere else. But something like this is very likely, though we have little direct evidence of it. Just to show where it is in this reconstructed theatre, here's Bath in about the late 2nd century, as far as we know. Obviously, there was a lot more of it. This is a road coming down into the town. Recent work has shown this does in fact exist. It runs under the abbey. And there's some more open spaces around here and some more Roman buildings. But here are the baths. Here's the temple. Here's the theatre, all forming one structure. This building here might be a mansio type, but a very substantial building. Another baths, fed by one of the other hot springs. and scatters of buildings. These are all in existence by probably the late 2nd century. And this is a building with quite a lot of mosaics in it, again, found in the 18th century. What's quite interesting is that the bank is probably well dated to the later 2nd century. And it's been seen in a couple of places. But the shape, which is the well-known shape of Roman bath, if you look at it, there were later on in the Roman period, walls were built in the front of the bank. That doesn't concern us here. But the bank is a very curious shape, and it's actually very similar to the wall that the Romans built around the spring in the very first period, in the 1st century, when they were doing their engineering work. And this is a very substantial stone wall, lead-lined, that enclosed the spring and allowed it to be tapped and fed into the baths and the wastewater going down here. That shape has been pointed out is very similar to that shape. And it may well be that this is actually not any kind of defensive enclosure at all, but just a marking out of a religious precinct, this whole large thing. It's very small for a grand town, and Bath, this part of Bath probably wasn't what we would think of as a town, but it was in the middle of a town. There were definitely substantial settlement all around it. So that's what we've got. What kind of a theatre is it, and how does it fit in with other ones we know about? This is the remains that we know about of the theatre in Colchester, Camaldunum. Again, it's very substantial masonry walls, indications of a passage here, not because there's a wall, but because there's a paving that runs in here. And like the Bath, it's very much, it's the same sort of size. Most of these theatres I'm going to show you in Britain are about 70 metres across, 65 to 70 metres across. They're all very similar in size. This just shows you how the theatre at Colchester relates to the town plan there. This is and the temple. This is the great temple of Claudius, and the theatre's right next to it. Theatres do seem to have been used as an adjunct to religious ceremonies in the theatres and in the temples and around the temples. Remember that temples weren't congregational spaces except for the precinct itself. If you wanted to gather a large number of people together, you had something like a theatre would be very useful. This is what's thought to be the temple at Cirencester. We don't know enough about the plan of the detailed plan of building the Cirencester to know whether there's a temple associated with this. And by the way, you can see why I'm fairly confident about my theatre, because if people can make this a theatre, then I think that's fine. These are probably part of the stage. This is the curved building again with a passageway, and these are where the seats would be, and that's what we have. The plan, it's right up near the north edge of the walled city. These are the excavations that picked up the remains. This is the Roman city sort of around here, the walled area of the Roman city. Forum and presumed temple around here. So that we may be thinking that there should be a temple somewhere up here to go with the theatre. This is Canterbury, which is one of the more substantial ones. Again, this is two phases because it's been excavated more carefully. This is an early structure, probably maybe early 2nd century. This is the later masonry structure. This is part of it, probably late 2nd century. Dating evidence for these, a lot of these is a bit not as good as we'd like it to be, but it looks like it's probably that around about then. And again, you can see this will be the stage area, and this will be the passageway around, and the seats would be here. And this is how it relates to its temple. This is Canterbury again. Here's the theatre, reconstructed in more detail. Here's the Temple Precinct and the Forum Basilica. So again, this is a street between them, but a very close relationship. So it looks like we've got theatres in Britain, and I don't think this is a a revelation to those who studied it, are closely connected to theatres. Oh, this is just a rather grand reconstruction idea of the theatre at Canterbury. Looks remarkably like the theatre of Marcellus in Rome. I think it's unlikely it looked quite like that, but that's the scale of it. See how grand it is in relation to the buildings around, which are imaginary mostly, but of the kind of thing you'd expect. Now, Verulamium is slightly odd. It links into the next set of theatres I'm going to show you. It's right next to a theatre. You'll see that in a moment. Sorry, right next to a temple. This is the temple here. And it's more than a semicircle, as you can see. It's got a very large orchestra, which in its first stage was actually completely circular. Then later on, in the later 2nd century or early 3rd century, it was cut across slightly and the stage was increased in size. But this is very like a kind of theatre you get in France and that part of Germany that was part of the empire, where it's called a Gaulish theatre. It seems to be related to a specific need for some kind of theatrical stroke religious activity in the orchestra itself, unlike your standard Roman orchestra. You've got access into this central area from outside, but you've still got a stage. This is much more in Britain of a rural type of theatre rather than an urban one. But here it is, bang in the middle of Verulamium, associated very carefully with a temple. Here's the theatre at Verulamium. Here's the city, and here's the Temple Precinct with the temple there. So I said it's a more rural kind of theatre. Well, this is a rural theatre at Gospelx, which is a known Iron Age and Roman religious site south of Colchester. This is actually quite a similar size to the Bath one. It's about 65 metres across, only half of it excavated here, but enough of it to show that it's real. It had a timber early phase, but even its late phase, when it was rebuilt in masonry, had just a wooden wall around the orchestra. And at the outside of this wall, if these are stairs, you can calculate that this outside wall can be no more than 10 or 12 feet high. So it's a much smaller arena and probably much more timber in it than any kind of, there's no masonry picked up in any of these trenches here, just around the outside. And again, an access straight through to the orchestra where some kind of activity was obviously intended to take place, unlike in your standard urban Roman theatre. There are several other theatres that are claimed to be. There's one at Carmarthen, which is outside the city walls, and it's a very strange shape. Usually thought of as an amphitheatre, but it recently been thought to be a theatre because it's a very strange shape, like a very squashed egg shape, not an oval or a circle, and almost entirely uninvestigated in terms of its interior. And there is another one which is very like the Verulamium Theatre, in a rural shrine at Frilford or Marcham in Oxfordshire, which looks very much in plan like the Verulamium building. It's been excavated. Dating is not very clear. It's still being written up, but it's in the countryside. It's not associated with the town. And again, it's got this more than a circle, more than a semicircle, 3/4 of a circle orchestra. It's got a stage, but it's small, and it's got a seating arrangement that again is more than a semicircle. And it seems that there might well be these two types of theatres, one essentially urban and one essentially rural, though they obviously overlap as shown at Verulamium. So this comparison, I'll just this next one, just to show you, if those of you who haven't perhaps looked at theatres across the empire. The one on the left, top left, is actually Bosra in Iraq, sorry, Syria, in Syria. But it shows, and it's a very grand structure, but you can see here the skinae fronds, the architectural backdrop, the wings, as it were, and the seating in 3 tiers here, and the orchestra with a stage raised up above it. And all across the empire, these things are, well, they're almost identikit. This one is in Spain, Merida, Emerita Augusta, heavily restored, but all these fragments are known that it's real. We know that's what it looked like. Again, the seats, because this one is still used for concerts and performances. And again, note the concave center and the concave center. I could show you any number of those. So that's where we are. So comparison makes it, to me, quite clear that the theatre at Bath is a more fully Roman urban type. Generally, whatever the details, this is a type widespread across the empire, as you've seen here. The theatres with near circular orchestras are a Gaulish rural type. And this raises some interesting questions about the urban status of Aquae Sulis. Is it a town with an urban type theatre, or is it a rural shrine, as some people have said, even a rather grand one? There are parallels of these grand shrines in Gaul, for example, at Sensé, over near Poitiers. But perhaps it doesn't say anything about the urban status of Aquae Sulis, because its hot springs make the Roman city of Bath very much sui generis, its own thing. It's hard to compare it. So, to conclude, I believe I made a strong case for the existence of a theatre at Bath, and that it was a substantial masonry structure. And I've said, as I said earlier, that's not surprising given the monumentality and size and character and quality of the other Roman buildings we know about in the city of Bath. The details, of course, are highly speculative, but the Roman and at least superficially urban character of the temple of the theatre are, I think, quite clear. So there we are, Roman Temple at Bath revisited. I've finished, Tim, if you want to pick up from there. I'll stop screen sharing.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Peter, for that. A wonderful introduction to how to interpret some interesting archaeology from a variety of small holes dug into those various sites in the centre of Bath, and adding really a very important and very interesting additional dimension to what we think Bath was all about and how it worked. Now, if you've got questions that you'd like to pose to Peter, please pop them in the Q&A and we can pick them up from there. We've got a nice comment from Derek by the look of it, saying that he's well on the way to accepting your proposition, Peter. So that's very good. Very good news. I'm sure he's not the only one who sees that. And I thought it was a very interesting comparison with Sirencester, where again, it's pretty fragmentary evidence, but when you put it together on a plan as you did and show what's going on there, we really start to see something quite important. And as you say, there may well be a temple or something at Sirencester. Okay, we're starting to get one or two things coming in now. So keep sending them in.
Oh yes.
And ask where Verulamium is.
Right. Well, I can. Yeah, Verulamium is a straightforward question because that's the Roman name for St Albans. I should have said so for those who didn't know. Verulamium is the Roman, in fact, pre-Roman name for St Albans in Bedfordshire.
Yep, so that's good. Ben asked you what your favourite object from Bath is, which is a nice,
crikey.
Nice question tonight.
You know, I have a mealy-mouthed question when people ask me what's my favourite find. I say archaeology is not about finding, it's about finding out.
Very good.
I suppose one thing that really I really do actually enjoy thinking about is when almost the first year I was in Bath, I was working with Barry Connolly in the Temple Precinct, excavating Roman remains, and which the Victorians who'd been there before us had left behind, and some Victorian structures. We were taking apart a Victorian wall, which had been built across the Roman remains to support a later floor, and built into the wall was a piece of Roman sculpture. It was a rather fine piece when we cleaned it up. It was a hunting hound looking back over its shoulder, and next to it was a very bottom end of a human figure with a bow. And a few days later, we found the other half of that piece of stone in the Roman remains that the Victorians hadn't disturbed. And that is now part of what we call the facade of the Four Seasons, another Roman structure in the Temple Precinct.
Excellent, that's good. A number of people have pointed out, Peter, that in fact Verulanum is in Hertfordshire, not in Bedfordshire.
Sorry.
The tongue there.
So much for modern geography.
Modern geography. But that's okay. Now, Rosalind's asked an interesting question about whether there's any small finds from the area that might support the temple, the theory of it being a theatre.
Yeah, well, no is a short answer. The great, all of that part of the, well, except for the little bit that I showed of concrete structure that was under the corner of the abbey, the rest of it was dug by builders under the command of the architects building the extension to the Roman Baths Museum, that was what was being built when Richard Mann found the theatre, and no finds were recovered, or very few. I can't think of any that are in the collection that specifically might support that, but it's rather hard to imagine what they would be other than a ticket or something.
If you had the ticket from the Roman performances, that would be really very special indeed.
They do exist, such tickets from the Colosseum. So
there we are, worth watching out for. And on a similar vein, Richard's asked a couple of related questions. Really, did the performers travel from far to perform here? Were they perhaps local, and were there perhaps gladiators and things going on here, or was it plays, poetry, or what?
The only evidence for gladiators is I think there is a gladiator. I can't remember now, but I think there's a gladiator Samian, a piece of Samian with gladiators on from the baths. But basically, I don't think that a place like this would be a place where you'd have gladiatorial combat. The theatre is not really, if I'm right about its shape and so on, doesn't really lead itself to that. There may be an amphitheatre somewhere outside the walls of Bath. That's where you usually find amphitheatres, are usually outside, not in every case. But Bath is such a curious, Aquae Sulis is such a curious place. And there's definitely a very substantial settlement to the north of this enclosed area that I was showing you on one of those features, one of those plans. But the actual area around the precinct, it does seem to be in very much a religious holy site. It was not probably a place that you, even going to the baths was probably part of the religious activity, the rituals that you carried out and so on.
Yeah, and for following that up, Jenny's got an interesting question. You mentioned about the use of the theatre for religious purposes, but how likely is it, she asks, if there are dramatic performances carried out there, and what kind of people went to these theatres? Were they urban living people or what?
This theatre, we rather assume that since Aquae Sulis must have been a pilgrimage centre, as it were, what the Roman baths, the temple, and the supporting settlement where all the shops and everything, and workshops and hotels and whatever it must have been, suggests that this was there because people came to visit, and they probably came to pay their respects or ask for favours from the goddess Solis Minerva. They came to bathe, and they would have come to performances in the baths. So these are probably mostly visitors coming from afar. We know that people came from Gloucester, Cirencester, Chartres, Trier. These are we know from inscriptions, and there were probably people from all over, at least the Western Empire. People may have come from further afield because there are scatters of Eastern Roman coins, empire coins, found in the vicinity of Bath. But I think there probably would have been, certainly probably in the later period, dramatic performances. But I think the essence of it was that it was a religious performance. That's the origin of theatres in the Greek world, that they are for religious performances.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I've been to one or two performances in classical theatres, in the Theatre of Herodaticus, for example, in Athens, and they are truly amazing when you see those things in action. It makes you wonder whether one or two of the British ones could be brought back into use. Probably not in Bath just at the moment, but nonetheless.
Not unless you pull down the Abbey.
Well, pulling down the Abbey is sort of part of series of questions here. So there's several people basically asking, where would we have to dig to find the rest of it? I suppose that's
right.
what underpins it. There's
well,
the fact that the Abbey's been looked at recently.
There is an open space in front of the Abbey and north of the museum, under which the northern half of the theatre might well be. It's always been an open area. There are, on its northern side, this open area has cellars, but they probably, from what we've seen elsewhere, don't go deep enough to remove Roman remains, substantial Roman remains. So it's theoretically possible, but because if any of you have ever been to Bath in the tourist season, or even in the low season, that area in front of the Abbey is full of visitors, queuing for the Roman Baths Museum, queuing for the Abbey, buskers, people sitting down eating their sandwiches. It's really a nightmare to actually try to think about digging it. It also has some very, very expensive and irreplaceable pennant slabs, which would have to be lifted, stored, and insured.
I suppose these days, though, ground penetrating radar or something is perhaps
yeah, that might make a lot more sense.
To use to help us understand a little bit of it more. You can probably see this one, Peter. Lauren Nichols asked a very interesting question. Could there be a connection with the large stone theatre mask in the Roman Bath collection, believed to have been part of a funeral monument? I don't know if you know about that one or can help us with
yes,
that.
Well, it could be. I should have put that in, but I was trying to keep the length down, which I think I succeeded in doing. Yes, it's from a tomb, but whether or not I mean, we don't really know exactly where it came from. We think it's in the Roman cemetery that runs north of the city on the road to London, like a lot of these remains that were found. But it does indicate some interest and knowledge of theatres and theatre symbolism. That's the unhappy mask, the dramatic mask, as opposed to the tragic mask, in other words, and then the comedic mask we don't have. Yeah, I'm sure it probably does reflect, but it's hard to know exactly what it reflects. Maybe just an enthusiastic theatre goer.
Well, that's a good word, couldn't it? And I guess one day, of course, a nice inscription might turn up. But a slightly more light-hearted question from Linda and Tony, who sort of possibly part answered this, but they make the point that Shakespeare made his money at the Grove from refreshments. Were there jigs and dogfights and all sorts of other things going around our Roman theatres, and could be more of a commercial enterprise as well as a religious enterprise?
Well, yes. I mean, I think you have to remember that running a temple, as it were, is actually quite a business enterprise. It's rather like running a monastery. I mean, we don't know. We know that there was a college of a guild of relatively well-off people who paid for some of the work and some of the repair work. We have inscriptions saying that one of the structures in the Temple Precinct was rebuilt and repainted by several guys, give their names. And the money was usually in the earlier empire. If you were a keen, active, and wealthy citizen, you would donate money for public works. But I'm sure that the temple organization, about which we know next to nothing, would have owned property, land, and made money. And of course, it would have, if you wanted someone to write you a curse or a supplication to the goddess to throw into the hot spring, no doubt money changed hands when you did that. If you wanted someone to make you a sacrifice, a priest to make a prognostication for you, money would change hands. So, you know, you can't divide the two, really.
Nothing new there at all, is there, really? Okay, now there's a couple of interesting, slightly connected questions. Tia asks about the question of why the remains at Bath are really rather decomposed. I guess one means not very well protected and preserved, and she wonders whether it's dry, or he wonders whether it's rather dry climate there. And then Eric asks about the question of recycling and reusing parts. And I guess Bath is one of those towns that's had the recycling of Roman masonry going on and on and on forever.
Yeah, well, indeed. the big piece of cornice that I showed you was one of the slight bits of evidence for the theatre being elsewhere, that big carved piece of stone. That was built into an 18th or 19th, or an 18th century footing when it was found. The pump room, the 18th century, late 18th century pump room, which sits over the Temple Precinct, has masses of large Roman blocks built into its footings. In fact, we recorded them a few years ago as part of work on redisplaying the Temple Precinct. You have to remember that in the Middle Ages, it seems that most of the Roman stuff had survived. The Abbey and its various incarnations probably destroyed a lot. The Saxon Abbey, which we have some dates for now, 7th and 8th and 10th century, probably use a lot of Roman stone because it's right on top of the Roman remains. We first start to get some indication of the fact that Roman remains were being found and destroyed during the 18th century, when so much of Bath was redeveloped as part of the grand redevelopment of Bath into a Georgian city. And there are one or two of architects, recorded material that came up during footings being dug for their buildings. We have the archaeology shows us where where later buildings have dug into the Roman remains. The Roman remains are actually, for an urban site, really well preserved in the vicinity of the Baths and Temple, and indeed these remains of the theatre are also relatively well preserved, except where they were deliberately dug away in the northern end for the foundations of the new cellars of the new museum, you then get the 19th century, the 18th and the late 18th, early 19th century, people start getting more interested. They're recording the remains, but still digging them out if they were in the way. And then gradually starting to, with Major Davis, who I was rather down on, but Major Davis, who was a city architect in the late second half of the 19th century, actually is the guy who preserved what we do have of the Roman baths and temple, and made it available to the public, didn't cover it up again. He persuaded the city council to pay quite a lot of money going back to an earlier idea, on the understanding they would make a lot of money by charging entrance fees and so on. But he was the first really to actually preserve and display what we had.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to see, isn't there? Andrea asks an interesting question, which you may have partly answered, Peter, which is actually about the chronology. What can we say about when it was first built? Do we know anything about that, and how long did it last, and when did it go out of use, and so on?
It's in the sequence of buildings in that vicinity, it's early, because it sits at what is the lowest Roman level that we have in excavations. We know that it predates that 2nd century gravel courtyard that I was talking about. Most theatres around, urban theatres that have any dating, appear to be sort of 2nd century and mid and later 2nd century. Some are probably, one or two might be a bit later. So a lot of work was carried on in and around Bath, in around the baths, and the baths themselves were modified and upgraded and so on. In the 2nd century, there was a big period of redevelopment in the Roman baths in the 2nd century, and the area around the baths was pretty much replanned and rebuilt. So it would fit into that sequence of being 2nd century. How long it lasted? Well, we know that it was still standing when a structure was built against it, probably in the 3rd century. We know that the baths were still in use in the second half of the 4th century. The temple was in use until was definitely in use as a temple up until the later 3rd century, later 4th century. And we know that the temple went out of use pretty thoroughly. The Temple Precinct went out of religious use. I still think it's going on there, probably by about 450. So it's probable that the theatre declined during the 4th century, and then in the 5th century was just a hulk and a convenient quarry, probably.
That may even feature in that Anglo-Saxon poem, The Ruin, I suppose.
Yeah. So,
couple of questions to finish off with, I think. Mark asks whether we know who the gods or the god was that was worshipped at the temple in Bath. I think we probably know about that, don't we?
Yeah. Well, the goddess is always described on the inscriptions and on the curses and on the various bits of bronze and silver plate that we found that were thrown into the hot spring as Sulis Minerva. That Sulis is a Celtic god or goddess, could be either, who the Romans seem to have come across when they came to the spring. And Minerva is, among other things, the goddess of healing and wisdom, and also of war, actually. But she seems to have been close enough to what the Romans were able to discover about Sulis for them to think they might well be the same thing, really. The Romans were very keen to absorb the gods and goddesses that they came across in their conquered provinces. They didn't think they were rubbish or bad. They just thought they were another aspect of their own gods and goddesses. So Sulis Minerva, there are one or two dedications to Diana, Aesculapius, who is the god of healing, again, a secondary god of healing, and one or two sort of probably imported gods and goddesses from other parts of the empire. People who were visiting brought them in.
Yeah, that's good. Final question, I think, which is a slight interpretation of a couple of things that have come in. Was there any music there? Did temples and theatres at this time involve music or celebrations of music in any way? Music
was used in temples and in temple precincts to drown out any inauspicious sounds. A dog barking, for example, would be a bad sign if you were about to make a sacrifice. Somebody laughing and joking or coughing outside the temple precinct would be a bad sign. So you play trumpets and bang drums and cymbals, and then hope that that the gods wouldn't be offended by any of these nasty sounds coming from outside. I'm sure that music was used in theatres, but I think I'm not sure that I know enough to answer the question in detail.
No, well, that's great. I'm sure there probably was. It's probably time, Peter, to draw things to a close a little bit and to thank you very much indeed for a really illuminating lecture in terms of helping our understanding of Bath and moving forward all sorts of ideas. We don't really have a facility on this webinar series to give you a big clap, but I think we can see from the chat and the comments that there's lots of appreciative comments being made as people come and go. But thank you very much indeed for that.
You're welcome.
Can I just call on Martin Watts, who's going to say just a few words of thanks. Martin, if you're there. Take off your mute button.
And appear.
There he is. Here he comes.
Yes, I am here. I hope you can hear me. I can't see myself.
No, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
There
you are.
I am. Hello, everybody. And just to say a big thank you to Peter. Before I do that, I should say that I think Pete's been very modest this evening, in as much as he made only one casual reference to his new book. So, Pete, I'm going to plug it for you now. Because,
thank you.
Last year, if you don't know, Pete wrote a new book on Roman Bath. It's entitled Roman Bath, A New History and Archeology of Aquae Sulis. And it's published by the History Press, 2021, available online from all good bookshops, I think is the expression.
Right, thanks for the plug.
That's my pleasure, Pete. And thank you very much for a really quite splendid lecture. It's good to see you again, as Tim said at the beginning. Pete's a former colleague of mine at Cotswold Archaeology, and he's still a very good friend to Cotswold Archaeology as well. So thank you, Peter, for your time and for the preparation and presentation that you've given us this evening.
Oh, well, glad you liked it.
Grand. Thank you, Martin. Well, if we were in a theatre tonight, I suppose we'd probably say that the books are on sale in the vestibule outside on your way out, but merchandising is not something that's easy to do in these sort of webinars. So in bringing the evening to a close, can I thank everybody for joining us today and for listening in to what Peter has to say and for asking a whole range of very interesting questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There was quite a lot of them on the list. We did our best to cover as many as we can. Of course, a venture like this involves a lot of organisation and putting together behind the scenes, and I'd just like to thank Caroline Adams from Cotswold Archaeology, who's been responsible for putting this all together. She has quite a big team of people working with her as well. So thanks to everybody who's been involved in putting this together and for running our lecture this evening. Well, we'll have another Mick Aston lecture next year. It'll be the 29th. I don't yet know who it's going to be, but please do join us this same time next year for the next lecture. And there's a little survey on your way out. We'd love to hear from you. So enjoy your visit home, your journey home, and I hope we'll see you again next year. And thanks again to Peter.